Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Andrew King, a researcher at McMaster University. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
In the interest of full disclosure, I met Andy in 1986, which is 33 years ago, when he was practicing law in Toronto.
That's right.
So, Andy, give us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm based in Toronto, have been most of my life. Like many people in Toronto, I'm not born there. I'm a child of immigrants that immigrated after the Second World War, grew up outside of Toronto, but then looking for work, Toronto sucked us in. And I went to school there, and as you mentioned, I went to law school in Toronto. I didn't really leave until, I guess it was 1986 to come here. So that's sort of in a brief kind of way, my background. But I grew up at a time when getting into university was much easier, at least in terms of costs, and was able to not only get but also to pursue something that I wanted to do, my parents wanted to do, which was to go to law school, which I did. And I graduated from UT in '79. But it's around that time, because there was so much activity going around, I discovered that I wasn't really interested in law in a traditional sense, right? Working for people with lots of money and making lots of money. I was more interested in the advocacy part of it. I had this very important experience while I was at law school. A friend of mine I met when I was at law school asked me one day if I wanted to do something useful while I was at law school. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting thought. I'm not seeing anything useful here yet. And he took me to what was a student legal aid clinic at that point at the Union of Injured Workers. And that became a turning point in my career, in that I became interested in the whole question of how injured workers were being treated. And beyond that, the interest of how we treat each other in society, particularly those people who are, quote, less fortunate than others or have less wealth than others. And so while I did pursue a legal career, part of that was in legal clinics and partly in private practice up until, I guess it was 1989 when I decided to change.
And so a number of my guests are kind of at the end of their formal work career. And we get to kind of reflect back a little bit as kind of, you know, what did we learn along the way, if it was anything.
If anything, yes.
But you know, no doubt we'll get to share some of that. But so when you left private practice, you moved into the next stage, and what was that about?
Well, I joined the labor movement. I was hired by the United Steelworkers Union as their director of health and safety. And I came at that because my experience with law and the practice of law was a bit different from other people, in that I had worked with legal clinics, I'd worked with the Union of Injured Workers, and I saw the importance of people's participation in their own struggles. You know, the classic picture of a lawyer is someone who represents other people. So, you know, you sit in your office, someone comes to you and gives you like a package, their problem, and you're to do it and solve it and charge them huge amounts of money. And what I experienced myself in that period was that I often wasn't able to solve the problem. At least I could solve it in a narrow sense, but not in a way that was most useful to them. And this was particularly true for injured workers, is that their problem wasn't them at all, in fact. Their problem was a system that didn't work and that treated them badly. And so I began to realize, particularly working in association with the Union of Injured Workers, which was a group of injured workers mobilizing to improve the situation for themselves and for other injured workers, that I wanted a different approach. And through my career as a lawyer, I had, this was the 1980s by this point, and I had done a number of major cases in front of the new Workers' Compensation Appeal Tribunal at that point, and had come in contact with the labor movement. And I saw the potential, particularly as it happens with the Steelworkers Union, who had a history of representing injured workers. In fact, the reason I became a steelworker, and I'm still associated with him today in a new adventure, it was a fellow by the name of Fortunato Rao in Toronto, who was a steelworker staff rep. And in those days, the only union staff rep that I knew that actually worked with injured workers and helped organize them and saw the importance of doing that. And so that gave me this sense, okay, well, I can continue to act solo, or I could actually maybe work with other people and spread out and branch out and help make a bigger difference. And so the opportunity arose, and I was given that opportunity by the Steelworkers in 1989, and so that's where I went.
So now the Steelworkers is one of the biggest unions in Canada, and it's not just workers that make steel.
No, that's very true. And when I joined it, it had changed its name to Everybody's Union, and it was very much so, particularly where I come from, which is in Toronto. Toronto is home to, even today, somewhere between 12 and 14,000 steelworkers, none of whom will work in the steel industry. And even in the time when I started, they were very strong in the mining industry, very strong in manufacturing, industrial, and in the last 2 decades in particular have moved very much into other areas as well. The largest local of the steelworkers in Canada is the Staff Association of the University of Toronto, for example. And I think what that is that unions aren't defined by who they represent, they're defined by how they represent. And I think that's what the steelworkers have, what has enabled them to maintain, and other unions have enabled them to maintain their importance in society today.
Well, and it's interesting because our experience here in Thunder Bay, when we started our injured worker support group, the Steelworkers Union here in the office and the staff rep, Moses Shepard, were the first that came and said, how can we help?
As you may recall, Moses is a mentor of mine as well. He's certainly been a major inspiration in my life. And in fact, when I came to the Steelworkers, I had to become a member of the Steelworkers Union, and I became a member of Local 5055 here in Thunder Bay, in part so that Moses would then be my staff rep. I was fortunate I didn't have to call on him for any assistance other than advice, which I did on many occasions, and I valued very much. But I think that also, for me, it was that aspect of their work, of the work of the union and of all of the steelworkers, this idea of representation was what drew me to them, because that was what I was interested in. I was interested in how do we create a better society, how do we enable people to make a better society by engaging them directly, not just as bodies and numbers, but as full participants in the process itself.
And so your focus with the steelworkers was on occupational health and safety?
Occupational health and safety, injured workers or workers' compensation, and the environment were my major areas of concern. And while I did do individual representation, inquests in particular was something that I was assigned to all over the country, particularly in the mining industry, and I did write briefs and documents. I always felt, and I think it's correct to say, my major responsibility wasn't what I did, but what I was able to help other people do, both in terms of educational programs, training programs, whatever support the big union could put behind what was happening in places as far apart as Thompson, Manitoba, Toronto, Vancouver, wherever.
Andy, we have to take a short break. Please stay with us and we'll find out a little bit more about how that really works in the Steelworkers Union. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Andrew King, a researcher and a senior researcher at the University of McMaster University. Sorry about that, Andy.
That's okay. I'm only a researcher in residence.
In residence.
So I appreciate
But they let you out for today.
They let me out for today. I mean, I've had a long association with McMaster, particularly the School of Labor, which I think is worth a plug because it's played, I think, such an important role certainly in Ontario and Canada in terms of providing resources to research and investigate concerns that affect working people. And that's why I think after I retired from the steelworkers, that's why it became sort of my home away from home, because the researchers who were there, the professors who were there, are looking at all sorts of important aspects of life as they affect working people, union and non-union. It's an important place.
Well, let's come back to that, but let's go back again to your job with the steelworkers as the national health and safety rep. And one of the real high-profile issues that you dealt with in your term there was the disaster at the mine in West Ray.
Right. Yes.
And I think that's maybe an example, a little bit of what you're talking about. That it's an event that you and the steelworkers tried to use to make a difference for the future for all workers.
Very much so. I mean, it's part of the unfortunate thing about representing people in heavy industry is that people are killed still today. Indeed, they're killed, and the number of people killed at work hasn't really changed much over the period of time that I was employed by them. I mean, it's quite stunning. Despite so much progress in so many areas, that still happens. And indeed, one of my jobs was regularly to represent the union and families of deceased workers at inquests. But the West Ray one was somewhat unique because of its size. 26 men were killed when that mine exploded, all at once, yes. And indeed, the one ray of good fortune was it happened at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on what they call the back shift. Had it happened, it could have happened during the day. It's just coincident it happened at that time. Had it happened during the day, there would have been 40, 50, many more people killed, all killed in an instant. And I arrived the night of the explosion. It was like a war zone. There's no other way to describe it. The family was all families of the miners who still hadn't been recovered, and they were being promised still they would be recovered. We're all in a fire hall adjacent to the mine site. And it was just craziness because it was such a traumatic event. And I think what came out of that, the expiration of the events leading up to it, which only happened because the union, as an organization across Canada, lobbied the government of Nova Scotia to hold an inquiry into it. They didn't want to, but they were pressured politically to do so. And by doing so, it also enabled the retention and collection of all these documents related to it. And what the inquest went on for a considerable period of time. The employer and the leads of the employer, the president, et cetera, fought tooth and nail, went to the Supreme Court to stop it from happening, back and forth. Huge investment by the union in order to make this happen. Because what it did, what the inquiry exposed, is just how reckless this employer had been, how reckless they were about the safety in a mine in an area which was notorious for problems. It was a coal mine, huge coal mine, where the coal seams were the whole side of the back, which meant there was no rock really to hold it all together. It was just coal they were mining in, which made it an extremely hazardous environment. And the inquiry went on for weeks. There's a huge amount of details that explore all of this, and I certainly would recommend people to read up about it, because there's certainly a lot published now about what we know. But the thing that struck me right from the beginning was the steelworkers were in the midst of an organizing drive when this happened. There had been a previous organizing drive by another union that had been defeated in part because the employer interfered. And the labor laws in Nova Scotia were then, and still are, so weak that the employer could do that, which meant that the workers had no representation at work. And in a mine where there were all sorts of hazards. And what they did, what the inquiry demonstrated is they threatened workers. The management, supervisors threatened workers. You don't like working here? You don't like the conditions here? Then leave. There's a whole lineup of people next door ready to come in. And so they had, in that sense, workers were trapped, right? They needed work. I mean, it's not an area that's known for employment. It was good work in that sense. It paid relatively well. And people had been promised 25 years of work. They had been recruited from across Canada to work in this mine. And yet, when it came to actually doing something to improve the conditions that they knew were wrong, they were handcuffed. They couldn't do anything because they weren't able to represent themselves, and the government at the time and the agency responsible for health and safety followed this principle of safety, which we see now happening again, and it happens over and over again in government situations where the government supports the industry and not the workers, is that the government basically left it up to the employer and the workers to resolve things. So even though there was an inspector who went in, they never followed up on the orders that they wrote, or they never did this, they never did that. You know, there was no enforcement of the problem. So you have no effective participation by the workers to make things better. You have no effective enforcement by the by the government. There's no wonder in my mind why the Supreme Court judge who adjudicated over the inquiry, the title of his report is A Predictable Path to Disaster. Because it was very greedy men in charge of the company who had a contract with the government of Nova Scotia, take or pay it was called. The government would take everything that the mine would produce, and it would take or pay. They would pay for the full cost, and they were just going to do that. They were going to make as much money as they could, as quickly as they could, and in the end, they didn't care what happened to the men, and in turn, as a consequence, weren't caring what happened to the business, and it collapsed when it exploded in May 1992.
And of course, this has relevance here in our area in Northwest Ontario because mining is a big economic activity.
It is.
And we hear continually pressure on government to make the conditions right for the mine, to bend over backwards. And what we're hearing from that experience in Nova Scotia, that there are some downsides to that strategy that that we need to really be aware of and take into account.
Yes. Well, I mean, mining has a whole range of challenges, from the environmental as well as from the health and safety perspective. But I think that it's particularly problematic when government ignores the protection of workers. I mean, of course, they never say that. Right. They say that they care most about the workers and all that sort of stuff. But when you look at what they do and what they require, that's not always clear. Now, Ontario is a little bit different. There's a much stronger tradition of unionization in the mining industry in Ontario. You know, the Steelworkers Union in particular has played a very high-profile role in improving the safety. Just recently, within the last 5 years, was an inquiry into deaths at the Valley Mine in Sudbury. So that's a bit different.
We need to take another short break. Mm-hmm. Please stay with us, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Andrew King, a researcher in residence at McMaster University. So, Andy, you worked with the steelworkers, you ended up retiring, and then you went back to school and started focusing on your academic career.
Yeah, I went back to school because I wanted the opportunity to think about what I'd been involved in over the past 30, 40 years. And what had happened and what worked, whether there's some lessons, sort of an opportunity to reflect. If I may, just as a slight promo to one side, this is why it's so important that all Canadians have access to pensions, right? That we need to improve CPP for everybody and have everybody access to it, because what it enabled me to do at a reasonable time in my life was to leave work, which meant I created a job, an opportunity for someone else who was younger than I to take on that responsibility, but with a reduced income nonetheless, to be able to pursue something that I think has been useful to not only to me but to others. Mm-hmm. So I was able to do that, My main focus when I was studying was to look at what had happened to workers' compensation over the last 30 years, the period of time that I'd been involved, as it were, and to explore this, what had happened. And what I noticed in that, and what has been really part of what I've done, and I know part of what you've done, is this important relationship that developed. I refer to it as a movement. Whether we call it the health and safety movement or the injured workers movement, there's the women's movement, these are all movements of social justice that have formed. They go much further back than 30 years. The health and safety movement goes back to the late 1800s. But it was an alliance between workers, organized workers through their unions, but with researchers, doctors, people in all parts of society, and governments and political parties working together as part of this movement to improve social justice. And that's what came out of my research, is it came so clear to me that all the pieces of these puzzle, at least in terms of the efforts to improve things for workers, were a part of this movement that had happened. Now, this movement has confronted and is confronting today an alternative movement, I suppose, a movement that's not about social justice. It's about greed and about wealth and the accumulation of wealth by a small number of people. And it's been those sort of the conflicts of those movements, really, that have been of particular interest to me. But at the micro level, right? So I'm not studying it like as sort of looking at the big picture of how the world turns, but what do individuals do? How do individuals become active? What motivates them? Why do they do this? And with a number of other people, both other health and safety activists like myself in the trade union movement, people from the occupational health clinics, which we're fortunate to have. You have one here in Thunder Bay. And some researchers at McMaster and other. We collaboratively, we call ourselves LOARC, an acronym that sort of covers us but doesn't necessarily explain who we are. But we decided to put together a number of research projects that would look at some of these aspects. So we did a project on what makes a person effective health and safety representative, because in Ontario, every worker has the right to be represented on health and safety, either by a committee representative or by individuals. And then more recently, because of the changes in our economy, with Wayne, did a project looking at what happens to people who complain about a problem, health and safety to the employer, and then get fired, which is illegal in our province. It's very clear. Everybody will tell you. You go on the Ministry of Labor website. It's the worst thing that can happen, according to our system, is that an employer fires somebody for refusing unsafe work or for complaining about health and safety. But it happens. It happens, in fact, not all the time, but not infrequently either. I mean, there's been over 2,000 complaints in the last 7 years formal complaints that went through to the Ontario Labour Relations Board. So we looked at that.
Which is about unsafe work, about here I'm facing unsafe work, my coworkers are, I think there's a problem, we might get hurt.
Yeah.
And you make a complaint.
That's right. And in most of the cases we looked at, those people were then fired by their employer. And they decided then to move on and make a complaint and do something about it. There's many things we could talk about, but the thing I think that's most important for me is when I interviewed 25 people, we reviewed over almost 700 files. What was clear to me is people did this because it was the right thing to do. It was about protecting their health and safety, and they would say so. And they had a right to do that. Mm-hmm. And so it was really a question of people saying, okay, I know there's a risk here. We know from interviewing people that the number one reason why people don't make complaints about their health and safety is because they're afraid of being fired. Mm-hmm. How is this possible in this world today, in an advanced society like Ontario, that this is the case, right? Why is that? Why do we allow that to happen? But it happens, and it happens with great frequency. But fortunately, I think, in part because of the influence of the health and safety movement and its components, certainly because of the support of the labor movement on health and safety, which it does not just for its own members, but for workers generally, people are educated that they can what they can do. They can be more strategic about it, and there are people who are prepared to take the risk. And we need those people. They're absolutely desperate for people like that, because without people willing to take that risk, the consequences are tragic.
So we've got about a minute left, and in a way you really talked about the powers, the imbalance really between really the employer and the worker, oftentimes in government. So how do we ensure that we have a better, safer community and workplace? What are the key points there in that last minute?
Well, I think the key points are have high expectations. We should be demanding, not just individually, but collectively, that the quality of work should be safer and healthier for people. We spend so much time and effort now saying, how does this company make as much money as they can, instead of saying, okay, how can they make money and provide good work, decent work for the people who are working there. And I think that's the key message to that, is that social justice organization unions have to continue the education, continue the support, and convince people that doing the right thing is a good thing to do.
And the last, we just have 20 seconds, is around representation you're talking about. And what we're seeing in Ontario is an attack on that representation for low-income workers.
The attack on one of the key instruments of the movement, one of the key ways we move forward has been through particularly legal clinics. And this access to law movement, which has been so much a part of our province. And that is perhaps, of all the awful things that this government is trying to do, one that really strikes at the very heart of our intention to build a better society.
Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're out of time, and would love to have you back next time you're in Thunder Bay.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
Thanks for watching, and please stay safe.